My name's Andrew Laird. I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures. We're a small consultancy that works with public services, and we have a particular interest in supporting organizations to work better together at a place level, and we're working with a number of areas around the country on this. And I'm delighted to be joined by two brilliant guests. Ed Hammond is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny and has been considering the implications of a missions-focused governance and accountability approach. And Laura Hughes is a partner at Browne Jacobson and head of the public law team. And Laura advises local authorities and mayoral combined authorities on governance and risk issues. So missions are all the rage. We're hearing a lot about it. And the new government's national missions inevitably challenge the normal siloed working of public services and the behaviours and the governance processes which have become embedded as a result of a, inverted commas, new public management way of working. Mayoral combined authorities and councils will play a central role in the delivery of these cross-cutting national missions. Local places are now also increasingly focused on place-based missions, goals, priorities. Different places call them different things, which cut across organisations and service silos. So there's an interesting mix between what national government is trying to do in terms of missions and also efforts in places to join services up at a local level. And Ed has highlighted this as a much messier and necessarily more experimental way of working. And it's certainly not what our current governance arrangements and approaches were designed to support. So to get into this, Laura, Ed, and I will be discussing regional devolution structures and legislative framework, the current one, the risks and challenges of the current system, and what needs to change to adapt to a messier form of mission-based government. So in terms of housekeeping, we're recording this, and you can use the Q&A function at the bottom to post any questions that you might have. I hope that's clear. So to kick us off, Ed, I wonder if I could come to you first to give us some background here. So could you provide a brief overview of how things work at the minute and the different sorts of devolution arrangements which are in place?
Sure, yeah. So afternoon, everybody. So at the moment, the devolution arrangements in place are those that reflect the model really that's developed since about 2015, where we have a patchwork across the country of different deals done that look rather different in different areas, done at different times, and sort of Devo deal making, as it's been sort of called, has been quite iterative in nature. So different areas have done a wide variety of different deals. So Greater Manchester, for example, has a number of overlapping deals in place that reflect its growing capability and interest and appetite for devolved power. The sort of devolution framework as it exists, really, arrangements look rather more like delivery agreements than they do like sort of what you would consider to be proper devolution. Government is saying, here's some funding, but for this funding, you need to deliver outcome X. And that's really the way that it's gone over the course of the last few years. We've seen a bit of a shift in the last couple of years with the levelling up sort of activity of the previous government, whereby government has kind of slightly formalised different levels of I suppose, autonomy that areas are going to have associated with accepting different levels of enhanced governance arrangements. So there are different levels of deal making, and areas that are wanted to go for more ambitious deals, the sort of level 3 or level 4 deals, have to accept a greater, more robust approach to governance. In part, I think, because there's a recognition in the sort of the back end of the last decade, beginning of this decade, that governance arrangements in place at that point in respect of devolution did not really cut the mustard in terms of what they needed to do to satisfy both governments but also local areas about the credibility and effectiveness of devolution arrangements. So governance has been a developing and evolving thing. Initially sort of seen as a bit of an add-on, something that had to be put in place but people didn't really think very much about, towards being seen as actually much more central to the capability of organisations to deliver Devo. So that's kind of, that I think is a sort of summary of where we roughly are now.
Thanks, Ed. If I could just ask a quick follow-up question there. So you mentioned that they were largely delivery agreements and very much focused on what central government was trying to achieve. Do you think there's a risk? And we saw a little bit of this in the press, maybe about how mayors in particular maybe feel that they don't want just to become delivery arms for the government's missions, and that the different areas that they represent need to be able to focus on what they're doing as well. And are you seeing that? Are you getting a sense of that, or how do you think it will play out?
Well, no, because oddly enough, the presence of those agreements has sort of acted as the sort of foundation, I suppose, for mayors to do more
Yeah,
with the powers that they have in the areas which they hold responsibility. And this is one of the challenges and one of the big opportunities arising from devolution, because you've got these core powers, these core responsibilities, things that mayors have got to do. But around those, there's a wider range of softer duties, relationships, opportunities that mayors have been trying to capitalise upon. So the Devo deal itself is only part of the story, part of a wider narrative within the area about what the mayor's doing, how the mayor's responding to needs. Again, there's an opportunity there because it makes the mayor's role more flexible, it makes it broader, but there's a risk because it means that a lot of this stuff is happening informally. There are informal conversations. The mayor is trying to exert their influence in an informal way. And
yeah.
from a delivery point of view, that can be really, really positive and productive. But from a transparency and accountability point of view, it can be difficult to find your way through the networks, informal and formal, of systems and arrangements and relationships that exist.
Yeah, and then the other point I wanted to make just on what you said initially there was, I think you maybe referred to this type of discussion as being seen as the kind of dull bit of it, but I mean, my experience is that it is absolutely central, and but it is quite often an afterthought, isn't it? The people think, oh well, let's do all this exciting stuff, and we can work out the governance and accountability later, but it's absolutely critical to get that right and for that to be front of mind, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and government and many local areas thought made the mistake of thinking of this as the dull bit at the start.
Yeah,
You didn't think enough about, for a start, the relationship, for example, between mayors and combined authority sort of cabinets and boards. The thought wasn't put into how will that relationship be managed, how that would work in practice. Thought wasn't put into what are the most appropriate governance arrangements to be in place for combined authorities.
yeah.
Assumptions being that you're putting in place a local government style system of governance that didn't really meet the needs of these very, very different institutions. So I think governance has been playing catch up, but I think it's positive now that it's
Yeah,
getting the attention that it deserves. Rather late in the day, but it is.
yeah. And just something technical that some people may not understand there. So a mayor and a combined authority, and the two different, I mean, are they competing sources of power and influence or accountability, or how does the combined authority and the mayor link up?
Well, they shouldn't be, but in practice, in some areas, they are. So
Yeah,
the mayor is ostensibly sort of leads the combined authority, and it's the mayor's vision and strategy, as reflected in part in the Devo deal that will push things forward. But obviously, the cabinet. The combined authority cabinet is made up of the leaders of the constituent authorities, and when we say combined authority, we mean it is a combination of the local authority that exists within the area that the combined authority covers. So there is I suppose you could say, a creative tension between the leaders as represented on that board and the mayor. In some areas, they have a very productive and positive working relationship. In other areas, rather less
yeah,
so. And
I
and we've
think
seen that developing in some areas in different ways over the course of the last few years. But that's one of the challenges of governance in this space, definitely.
brilliant.
there's
Laura, would you like to?
some powers that are reserved for mayors, as Ed said, but not all of them. Some of them
Mm.
are combined authority powers. So there's some circumstances in which you need to combine the mayor's powers with the combined authority powers to achieve the things you want to achieve, and that can create tension as well. And then in the new combined county authority models, you've also got people around that sort of cabinet table who are not constituent councils and therefore don't have the same voting rights often. So it's an incredibly complex picture, as Ed said, and it can sort of lead to these kind of tensions. So it's certainly not straightforward. The other thing is that often in new combined authorities, the proposal or the vision, as Ed said, is actually drafted and consulted on before a mayor has been elected. So, you know, they come into that piece with a sort of preset sort of list of things that the combined authority, the councils that form the combined authority felt were priorities, but the elected mayor may come in with a different view. And so
interesting.
Places in which it can, you know, go wrong or not, as the case may be. But I think, you know, where combined authorities achieve the most, combined authorities and mayors achieve the most, is where they work together.
Yeah.
You know, that's
so the mayors are in this interesting position of kind of straddling the link, the link between, well, not the link even, just they're having to deal with central government but also the constituent councils who had to reach agreement in order to allow the mayor to exist in the first place. So sometimes, particularly with the inaugural mayors in places, I think what you're saying is you're finding that these mayors are getting elected to deliver on the agenda of the councils who agreed to let it happen in the first place, or is that oversimplifying it?
I mean, I'm not sure that's how the mayors would see it, but
no,
I think that's the way it plays out in the legislative process. There has to be a proposal from the councils that form ultimately the combined authority. That's consulted on with the public, and following that, if the Secretary of State is satisfied, a combined authority is created, and then a mayor is elected. But, you know, mayors inherently don't think like that. You know, they come in, they have a vision and they have a view, and they want to come in and do their own things. But, you know, there's sort of powers legislation that is set. But as Ed said, you actually can achieve a lot without even touching your powers. You know, that's the other thing. There's a whole kind of, as Ed was saying, sort of unwritten space in which things can get done through collaboration and using existing, you know, the Constituent Council's own powers together collaboratively with the mayor to deliver things that are actually not anywhere near what in the legislation the combined authority has powers to do. And it's a kind of influencing and engagement role, I suppose, as well.
Yeah. So Laura, I think this is a good moment to take a step back and bring everybody up to speed on the legislative environment within which all of this happens. So if I could ask you to take us through that. I know you've got a few slides that you'd like to share. So bear with. There we go. That's up. That's up and running.
See that? So I think just in terms of, let me just get to where I can navigate with my slides. Here we go. So I just want to spend just a few minutes just to kind of outline, not in any detail because it is incredibly complex, and one of my main points today is going to be that the complexity of the legislative position here is problematic in some ways because it is very complex, and as Ed says, has come around iteratively over time. So there's been this layering of legislation one on top of the other to achieve an outcome, and often trying to use local government legislation in circumstances where, again, as Ed has said, it's not really a standard local government organisation, so it doesn't always work. And there's a real problem with where you find out what the law is in any given area, because different combined authorities have slightly different powers and slightly different cuts between what's a mayoral power and what's a combined authority power. So frankly, if you're not a lawyer, I think there's a lot, it's going to be a struggle often to understand exactly what you're looking at. And even, to be honest, lawyers find it difficult because it's not very straightforward. So, I mean, at the moment, the figures being put out there is that when the sort of 4 new combined authorities that have been approved under the current government go through, there'll be 60% of the English population covered by devolution. It's vast swathes of the country are now under some part of the combined authority or about to be. I think we've covered a lot of this in terms of what they are. So the government would very much sell it as a devolution of power from Westminster to local areas, and it is in large part power and funding. But in terms of, again, a legislative and powers position, it can also mean that powers and duties which are otherwise carried out at county or district level, so potentially constituent council level, can also be given to the combined authority, and in a couple of cases around transport, potentially taken away from the councils at the more local level. So it isn't, you know, much as the government would want to bill it as this, a straight transfer of powers from Westminster. Powers can go in other directions as well, and that can sometimes be difficult for people to understand because the government very much don't sell it like that, because that doesn't suit the narrative. It's obviously very distinct from national devolution, although again, there's this now, they're looking at putting together the meeting of the mayors and the first ministers, which, you know, is not appreciated in the devolved nations, who think that that's completely inappropriate, and arguably it is, because what they have is legislation making powers, which is not the case. I mean, this is decentralization rather than devolution in truth, or delivery arrangements, as Ed said. So we have combined authorities and mayoral combined authorities. All of the combined authorities in the country now are mayoral. There was one that was not, but that's now been merged in with another to make the North East Combined Authority. The previous North East Combined Authority was not a mayoral combined authority, but it is theoretically possible to have combined authorities that are not mayoral. And the plan under the previous government certainly was that 2 of the 4 that have been approved this time, Lancashire and I think Devon and Torbay, were going to be non-mayoral. So that's combined county authorities. So there's a series of legislation which applies. So for the original combined authorities, they were set up under the 2009 Act that's cited there, but that in turn has been amended by 2016 Act and then by the 2023 Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Combined county authorities and mayoral combined county authorities were introduced under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act last year, and I'll come on to what the difference is. There are some local authorities with devolved powers, single areas. So Cornwall, for example, has a few devolved powers, but is not formally a combined authority. And then there's the Greater London Authority, which is a different thing again. But again, what you see often is the powers that the GLA have had, for example, around creation of mayoral development corporations, have kind of been lifted from those GLA powers and again attempted to be retrofitted into combined authorities in a way that doesn't always work. So this layering of legislation around establishment, it's been slightly different over time. So under the original 2009 Act for the original combined authorities, there was a governance review, a consultation, and a scheme published, and the Secretary of State made a decision and created the combined authority by order. In 2016, it became possible for the Secretary of State to do that without the input of the local authorities, although I don't believe that's ever been done. And then even now for old style, what I would call old style combined authorities, they now have to follow a process that's mirrored from the 2023 Act for the creation of combined county authorities. Slightly different, slightly more involved. So it's a proposal that's created, a consultation on that, consideration of that by the Secretary of State, and establishment under regulations. The tests under the 2023 Act are different and a bit more involved around the Secretary of State being satisfied it's positive for the area, around economy, efficiency, all that kind of thing. So there's sort of just a little bit more process in there in terms of getting things set up. Probably quite a good thing. It's a bit more transparent, I would say, but it's again, it's slightly different. It's all changed. So anyone who set up a combined authority under the 2009 Act, even now to set up the same style of combined authority would be done differently. In terms of geography and membership, again, so on the original 2009 Act combined authority model, you could have it was mainly unitaries, sort of city areas. But you could have districts, could join outside the area of the county or the upper tier, but upper tier authorities had a veto on this. So counties had a veto on their districts joining outside of their area. The 2016 Act removed that, so districts could join outside of their areas, although again, I don't believe that's happened. There was a judicial review in Derbyshire when they attempted to do it, and it didn't happen ultimately. And the 2016 Act also provided that only one of the county or district in an area, if they were both members, could be the constituent council. And there was no provision in that legislation for associate members, but to avoid some of the prohibitions of the original prohibitions of the 2009 Act around membership, a number of combined authorities introduced the concept of associate members, so not formal members, but members who attended meetings. Now, again, that's all completely changed, even for the old style combined authorities. So from 2023, there's a completely new governance model for combined county authorities and changes to the governance model for combined authorities. This is kind of Ed's point about things catching up to kind of almost cover what was already happening. So associate members are now a recognised thing in legislation for both combined county authorities and combined authorities, and have a status, which is that they're able to be at the table, but not automatically given a vote, and may be given a vote, but only in certain circumstances. So the sort of governance arrangements that have iteratively been created by literally combined authorities on the ground, coming up with something that works for them, have kind of now they've tried to enshrine them into legislation and make them more, I suppose, legally sound. But my concern is that it is a bit patchwork. It's kind of layered on top of what's already there in respect of the 2009 Act at least. And even on the 2023 Act for combined county authorities, there's a lot of sort of unwritten rules, again, to go to Ed's point, that, you know, certainly under the previous government, and it remains to be seen where we'll get to under this one, there was a bit of, well, I know it says non-constituent councils, but actually we've got a view about how many of those non-constituent members you should have, and they shouldn't outnumber the constituents, etc., etc. So what's in the legislation is probably not the whole story. Well, it's definitely not the whole story in terms of what will actually be permitted as far as governance looks, but it at least provides a framework for it now in a way that wasn't there before. Establishment powers and governance. So all combined authorities are created in the secondary legislation, orders under the 2009 Act, although that's now been changed to regulations going forward, and regulations under the 2023 Act. Same thing, really, just slightly different processes. But as Ed was saying, you know, some combined authorities, some of the original ones particularly, have multiple orders where they've had powers added over time. So Manchester has 13 separate orders. The original establishment order, which has been amended 6 times, and then separate orders around police and crime, fire and rescue, adult education and public health, and some of those have been amended. So, you know, if you're trying to work out what the powers are of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, that is not an easy task for anybody, even a lawyer, because you're looking across several sets of regulations over time, and cross-referring back to the original legislation as well. So there are currently in the UK 11 combined authorities or combined county authorities, and each one has a slightly different set of orders or regulations. So again, you can't look at one and assume that the establishment order is going to be the same, or that it will even cover the same powers. So there is now more of a kind of standard approach to what powers are devolved, and I'll come on to that. But that certainly wasn't the case originally, and arguably ought not to be the case. But there has been latterly a more standardisation of that. And then on governance, there's also 15 general regulations that apply to all combined authorities, touching on overview and scrutiny, finance, mayoral elections, borrowing, and spatial development strategies. So you're not only looking at your establishment order and your primary legislation, you're looking at 15 other sets of general regulations, and all the consequential amendments, as I say, that come out of the primary legislation and change all the other local government legislation to include combined authorities, combined county authorities. It is a labyrinth, and it is very difficult to navigate. So, you know, for lawyers, it's difficult to navigate. For elected members who are sat as a constituent council member for a combined authority, or for elected mayors, you know, incredibly difficult unless they've got legal training, I would say. Powers and duties, as I said, there's significant variation originally. Manchester and Birmingham are still ahead under the previous government, and again, question whether those will continue as they were announced, but trailblazer deals, so they're about to have additional new deals, Manchester and Birmingham, on top of the ones they've already got. But under the last government, we did see more standardisation, and I've listed out there the standard powers package, which included around finance, sort of business rate supplements, precept setting, local transport functions, adult education, housing, region and planning, mainly around land assembly and compulsory purchase, and the power to establish mayoral development corporations. But there are then all these extra things that some combined authorities have and some don't. And that's, you know, Police and Crime Commissioner, Fire and Rescue Service, additional finance, waste, jobs, public health. You know, East Midlands have got public health. One of the other newer ones, York and North Yorkshire don't. So, you know, there is still that variation coming through based on what local areas are asking for, which is fine. You know, there's an argument that the idea of combined authorities is to tackle local issues, and therefore you need some ability to not just be a standard list, but I guess navigating it is more complex when there isn't sort of just one size fits all. So where next? Well, it's extremely complex legislative framework. The local government models, as I say, is kind of try to take bits from the GLA, from the local government, provide the governance framework that sits over the top is largely drawn from local government, doesn't always work brilliantly, sort of overview and scrutiny. Political proportions in a combined authority are even harder than the local government, for example, you know, because you're looking at the combined authority area and all this kind of stuff. And you might not have that political representation on your cabinet because that's not how you elect them to cabinet. So it's incredibly challenging, some of it, and it doesn't just doesn't quite work. There was combined authorities. You've now got combined county authorities, so 2 different models coexisting with 2 models of governance, although the combined authority piece moving a bit more towards CCAs. Lots of kind of sets of legislation and secondary legislation to work through. And as I say, it's not standard. The current government is talking about an English devolution bill, and I was reading last night that meeting of mayors last week we'll start beginning to talk about the white paper and what that might cover. I have not heard what's come out of that, but it'll be interesting to know what that covers, whether it seems to be focused on more power, so more power being devolved, rather than looking at governance or any of the kind of base legislation. And frankly, I just suspect they haven't got the time or the inclination for that at the moment, because it would be a massive job. But it'll be interesting to see what this new devolution bill says, given we only got levelling up and regeneration in 23. It's quite rapidly then another piece of legislation around devolution. Local growth plans seems to be something that's being talked about in terms of being something new for combined authorities to produce and deal with. Whether that's policy or legislation remains to be seen. And as I say, I sadly suspect that it's too much to hope for a codifying solution of all the different law to put it all in one place. So it will probably remain quite complex to navigate. And there's a bit of uncertainty at the moment about where we're going next. But yes, it's kind of very spread out across lots of different legislation, very hard to navigate, and very sort of specific to each area. So you can't make assumptions across the piece.
Thank you very much. Just Laura, that was fantastically interesting, and I think links in well with a question which we've got here, which I'd like to put to both of you. So, given the rise of what you call decentralization, which I think is really interesting to kind of use that as probably the proper term rather than actual devolution of any legislative powers or anything, which is obviously to the nations. But this question is, given the rise of more mayoral combined authorities, are we inexorably moving towards local government reorganization and standardization? But I sort of saw this come in before your final bullet point about too much to hope for a codifying solution, and it doesn't sound like an English Devo bill is going to cover that. But it's a proper, I mean, you could say patchwork, but a mess, you could also say as well. What do both of you think in terms of where this ends up heading, and maybe over what time frame? Because surely it can't hold like this with the incredible amount of variation that exists across the line. Laura, do you want to come in first, and then I'll come to Ed?
So I think what's quite interesting about it is that it's the old adage, isn't it? All the public want to know is who's collecting their bins and who's making decisions about anything that affects their daily lives.
And potholes.
Exactly, all those kind of things. And bluntly, there's therefore there's no political value in this, in the sense of doorstepping. There's nobody on the doorstep saying, what you need to do is sort out the legislation around local government so that we can all navigate this more easily. And so I suspect the political pressure isn't going to be there in this government, or certainly in the early days of this government, to invest the amount of time that it would take to make this change. Whether over the long term that there just becomes a necessity because it's too difficult operating at, in some areas now with combined county authorities, you will have parish councils, you will have district councils, you will have county councils, you might have neighbouring unitaries, and then you've got the combined authority sitting over the top. And let's not forget other local governance structures like free ports and other development corporations, which are independent and separate and could in some places overlap with the boundaries of the combined authority, which is again not fully resolved in the 2023 legislation. So these things are just so complex that I do think eventually there will have to be a solution. I don't think it's going to be one of those we need to put years worth of work into working the answer out, and I'm not sure that's going to be happening anytime soon. But Ed's probably got more insight to that than me.
Ed, I'd like to bring you in now. I've got a few follow-up questions for you. Yes, there may, the average person in the street may not be crying out for reorganization of government, but surely in terms of things being delivered effectively, there's some sort of case for it.
Yeah, so I think government will be driven to action if and when it's convinced that making structural changes will lead to increased effectiveness of the sector, and also, importantly, the increased capability of the sector to deliver on governance priorities. So if you look at, I mean, we'll come on to missions momentarily, won't we? But the mission agenda led agenda is very, very important to government. And if government feels there are structural changes that it can make that would facilitate that happening, delivery against those missions, then it will take them. I don't think the evidence is there to demonstrate that, where areas have gone through reorganisation that's led to a sudden uptick in the quality of services, or in fact, there are areas that have gone through reorganisation in the last 15, 20 years where they've ended up in rather challenging, some areas, governance situations. It's a very, very difficult job, unitarising, and it takes headspace, it takes time, and those are two things which the sector doesn't really have at the moment with its financial constraints. It's a nettle that probably government, there are a variety of nettles that governments in the future we know will have to tackle. Local government reorganisation, the financial position of local government, sort of replacement for council tax is the other obvious one. It's one of these enormous public policy challenges like road pricing. At some point in the future, somebody is going to have to say, we've got to do this thing, but no government is actually going to be the one to do that. So it's a difficult balance to be drawn there.
Yeah. So Ed, I am going to come on to talk about missions, but before I do, I would love you both to think and see if you can give me some examples of where the current framework is working really well, and maybe some examples where it's not working so well. So Ed, do you want to kick off?
I think the two obvious examples, because they're the trailblazers, are GM and West Midlands, and they're the examples that people always give because they're the two that are most advanced. What marks them out over others is the quality of the relationships that mayors and other partners have managed to build around the devolution settlement. That's key to me to success, because Andy Burnham has done a huge amount to kind of build a structure now that's founded on the existing relationship between the GM authorities, which is unique to GM, that existed for very many years before he came on the scene. Andy Street, what he did when he was there, when he was mayor in WM, which obviously he isn't anymore, was to try and build a model around what he would describe as inclusive growth. So it was a very, very big tent attitude and approach towards bringing lots of people in, having conversations around them. So it wasn't for neither of those areas. You've got mayors who had a sense of what they wanted to achieve, but were willing to bring other people in to talk about priorities with them. Then you look at areas where the mayor's tried to come in and it's very much trying to rather vigorously set the priorities and said, right, I'm the mayor, this is what I want to have happen. So the obvious example of that is, somebody like James Palmer in Cambridge and Peterborough, who's not the mayor there anymore, where he ended up at loggerheads with many in the local area about that work. Another example is Ben Houchin in Tees Valley, where he's had a very, very ambitious and challenging range of things that he wants to deliver, that he wants to drive forward, and he's experienced real difficulty in getting others along that journey with him. Because in a way, you look at that and you say, well, yeah, as the directly elected mayor, why shouldn't you be able to kind of push forward that vision? That's what you're there to do. But it's a very difficult job, and I think that where mayors come unstuck, it's because of not realising that you've got to build these broad coalitions in order to take your stuff forward. And building those broad coalitions involves compromise on your part as well. And that's, when you're directly elected for a purpose against a manifesto, and then you've got to kind of work your way around a load of other people, many of whom are not elected at all. I can see how that would rankle, but that's the reality.
And I think I don't have much to add to that other than to sort of reflect on how that sort of sits with the legislation, if you like, which is that, it's interesting because it's clear from the way the legislation is set up, and whether this is intentional or not, I don't know, but it literally cannot work unless the parties work together. It is just not a model that will work if the parties aren't working together. So in situations like there was in Cambridge and Peterborough, where I know, and again, we've all anecdotally heard how difficult it got there, just nothing gets done because there is absolutely no way to achieve those things unless everybody's working together. What was interesting, I sat on a panel with Andy Street a year and a half ago now, and I was chairing the panel, and I actually asked him how often he used his powers, and he basically just said, well, never really. He actually didn't use the powers that were available to him to achieve the things he was achieving. Yes, occasionally I think they came up with something they wanted to do, and they would do that, or they would sometimes use the council's own powers to achieve the things that needed to be done rather than the combined authority powers. But to him, that was not, he had a vision. He was achieving it mainly through negotiation and collaboration, convening, not through using the formal powers, which just shows that it is very much about relationships and working together. And as I say, the way most of these combined authorities are set up with their governance models, things just could not happen. The mayor might be able to push one or two things through, but they wouldn't be able to get the other 50% of the stuff.
That's the reality, but is that a good way of how it should work? I mean, I know that's how it does work, but is that what it was meant to do?
I think it depends what you want. If you want councils to come forward, which is the way it's all designed at the moment, to say they want these things, they're not going to do that if they have absolutely no power over the outcome.
And if you're saying we're going to take everything, turkeys voting for Christmas.
Even now, in the current models, there can be moments where it suddenly dawns on the elected members of the constituent councils that they are giving some powers away, which is kind of goes back to the point at the start of my slides. Not everything is coming from Westminster. Some of the things will be going up, and that sort of, and then equally that the mayor might have powers over them that has come from Westminster that they didn't have before. And so, there is very much a kind of, I don't know what you need to do to get people to the table to be keen to do these things. You need to probably have the kind of governance model that there is. If you wanted to do what was done in academies where it's been sort of the school sector where it's been forced at times, you absolutely could design a system that did that, and you could put a mayor in charge and they'd have total power. But at the moment, this is the point about how it's kind of been layered on top of what's there. So you sort of need to have the buy-in probably of the local authorities that are part of it. Otherwise, they'll just never come to the table.
Really good, thank you. Ed, right, let's get on to missions now. So the government obviously have their national missions, and they will necessarily require cut across traditional organizational and service silos. You've, as I mentioned earlier, talked about how this will require a necessarily more flexible, messier form of governance. Could you just say a bit more about what all this will mean, and sort of maybe rehearse some of the challenges that this presents, and maybe even some of the ideas around how it might work better?
Yeah, so we're at kind of a bit of an inflection point on devolution in this context at the moment. We've got a new government in, obviously, that has this series of missions, long-term missions that it wants to deliver against. And obviously we have to remember that the last government had these as well, and they were central to the sort of Levelling Up Act, as was the delivery of a range of long-term missions for that government too. So, but they weren't able, really to capitalise on that intention. Nothing really happened. I think because for this government it frames everything that they're trying to achieve, you hope that with a following wind it's actually going to be meaningful. But government sees combined authorities, and to a broader extent local government, as being key to delivery of those missions. So we know that the attention given to devolution is framed by that will to deliver against the mission. So it is high on government's agenda to take this action, and it's I mean, that reflects the fact that we are, as Laura says, we're about to have a white paper on devolution. We're going to have a bill probably just about now in the new year. So it's an early legislative priority for government. And although I agree with Laura that we're not going to see a sort of major codification of a devolution arrangement, we're still going to see this kind of patchwork. It will bring, I think we can expect it will bring a greater degree of consistency to the picture that's been described that we have at the moment. How far government will want to go down that road, I think, as I said, is driven by what they think is necessary for combined authorities and other authorities to be able to deliver against those missions. We are going to have to get used to a different set of terminology as well. I've been reliably informed that there will be a new name given to sort of describe authorities with that kind of broad strategic responsibility, which may be combined authorities, county combined authorities, or individual councils that will be given enhanced rights over an area. So counties which will may be given certain powers under a future act. So the intention is, I think, that government that all of England will be covered by one of these kinds of authorities in future, and that deal making will reflect the need for everybody to have a form of those powers. So that's the starting sort of position. So there's something here about the governance of place as opposed to the governance of individual institutions within that place. Because up till now, we have talked about what's the position on combined authority governance, what's the position about governance in individual councils. And, you know, there are other institutions active in local areas that have their own governance needs and challenges. You know, the NHS has just undergone a massive structural change. You've got separate governance arrangements relating to, you know, police and crime, and you see police and crime commissioners taking on responsibility for fire and rescue, as you mentioned, and some of that being rolled into the power of the mayor. Then you've got other local actors who have no local accountability, you know, so the benefits system administered by DWP, all national. You've got utilities companies and bus companies as well that in many parts of England at the moment operate entirely separately and independently. So you've got this patchwork of formal and informal systems, many of which don't engage very closely together. And the challenge is saying, well, what's the governance system that's going to try and sit around and knit together some of those institutions? Now, the traditional approach that we take in this country to say how we're going to knit this together is say, let's invent another institution that will act as a you know, to knit these together, or let's give these powers to bring partners together to an existing institution. So I think if you look, for example, at the paper produced by Labour Together, authored by Sam Friedman, published last week, which is a really, really good direction of travel, I think, which gives you a sense about where government might be headed on this. The vision in that is very much give mayors a load of additional powers to bring partners around the table. I think that will be part of it, but you can never ever have a situation where mayors will basically be in control of everything in the place. It's not ever going to happen. You're always going to be a need to have some form of cross-cutting governance. If you're going to try and achieve cross-cutting policy objectives, which is what missions are, that cut across a range of national and local institutions, you're going to need cross-cutting governance systems to manage that approach. And saying, oh, it's all, you know, down to the mayor would be a simplistic approach to take. So at central government level, we're seeing the establishment of what are called mission boards to manage this. But at local level, it remains to be seen what's going to mirror that. I don't think it would be sensible to say mayors will be responsible for, you know, putting in place local mission boards, because it doesn't reflect the, you know, the cross-cutting nature of what we've got. So some areas have innovated to try and create this kind of cohesion, to try and create this cross-cutting thing. So we've talked about Andy Byrne, we've talked about Andy Street. Their approaches are examples of putting in place that cross-area approach where mayors are saying, I'm not in charge. I've got a kind of convening power I recognise here, but I'm not in charge of saying, you do this, you do that. It's sort of similar to what Donna Hall did in Wigan. You might be familiar with the Wigan deal and the arrangements that she and other, you know, politicians in Wigan put in place to manage relationships between the council and other public service partners. It's deliberately they're saying we're kind of first amongst equals here. We're not saying we want to be in charge, this is a power grab. It's about saying we're going to convene, but it's a debate, it's a conversation. It means this kind of governance is really delicate, and it rests on the presence of a key convening individual or a group of key convening individuals, which creates risk, because you end up with a transition. One mayor who's developed really, really good working relationships, you know, isn't elected again, and you get a new person in, you know, as happened in the West Midlands. What does that mean for that ongoing relationship? So I think there's probably another approach that doesn't necessarily look like, you know, assuming the mayor will control everything. And I think there is a recognition that approach is not realistic. I think there's going to be an agglomeration of some powers in the hands of the mayor. That is going to happen. And I think that's welcome. I think, it, you know, giving the mayor a more consistent and systematic range of powers, I think makes a lot of sense, because there are areas where you can say, well, you know, they should have more directive authority, but there are going to be other areas that are going to be in the hinterland beyond their formal powers, where we are going to need to have that cross-cutting approach taken. So our at the centre's approach is to say, well, you know, we should embrace the existence and presence of this mess. because it's always going to be there. It's always been there in sub-regional governance for the last however many decades. There has been this messy situation, and what the solution we've tried to put in place around it has been, let's create structures to eliminate the mess, but the mess persists. So I think we embrace it and we live with it, and try and understand what we can put in place to harness it, and use that to try and evolve some new and more balanced kind of governance arrangements. Now we and others have said, you can establish what we've called sort of regional public accounts committees, so groupings of a range of non-executives from a range of organisations who kind of act as kind of owners of the governance framework. So there's a degree of ownership of the relationships involved without that being directive. So it's not saying a person is responsible for getting everybody in the tent. It's giving ownership to a wider range of organisations to say, there's a group of people here who are responsible for supporting the health of the system overall, owning the system and making sure that it functions effectively for the benefit of everybody involved in the area. And that's something which has gathered a head of steam over the course of the last few years. But whatever structural solutions adopted, I think we need an approach to governance that's kind of relational in nature. It's about the relationships between individuals, the trade-offs involved in those relationships. I mean, Laura sort of mentioned and you both talked about the trade-offs involved that politicians sometimes don't realise. Oh, in creating a mayor, you're giving away some powers, and it's one of the reasons why people have been so unwilling to have mayors in areas, because they recognise actually this involves giving up powers. But if we can shift the mindset there, saying, well, there is a trade-off. If you're very interested in maintaining power for yourself, then this probably isn't for you, because delivery involves partnership and involves sharing power with others. So it's about recognising all the different push and pull factors that exist around power, and trying to systematise those relationships, trying to make those relationships more transparent, so people can see the mess. The mess is still there, and we're saying, look, it is messy, but here are the relationships. Here's what's important to the key different people in the room. Here's how we are having the conversation about determining what our priorities overall. And here's how those priorities are delivering against those missions. And you've got that clear link there. Then it you can see that's become more accountable. It's become more directive. So that's
very good.
That's kind of the position as we see it, I think.
Really good, Ed. Thank you so much. I just want to try and address a couple of quick questions which have come in here. So someone has just asked, so we're guilty of this on this chat, sort of interchanging things like MCAs, place. And this question that has come in is about when we say place, do we mean mayoral combined authorities? And I think that is a seemingly innocuous but really interesting question, because it really doesn't. Place has no kind of legal standing. But if you look at it as I often do from a health reorganization perspective, so if you were to take Cambridgeshire and Peterborough as an example, so that is the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough footprint is both a mayoral combined authority and an integrated care board from a health perspective. The health bit is split into two places in health terms: Cambridgeshire North, Cambridgeshire South, right? So not an MCA, but sub-MCA, but actually not part of the MCA at all. If you look at somewhere like Yorkshire and the Humber, there's a very large integrated care board there, which does not sit in any MCA footprint, and the places are normally a council footprint. So it's a great question. I don't want us to spend our last 9 minutes talking about that, but I think just places are not necessarily is not a defined term at all. So we just keep that in mind. And I'd love to get a view from you both. So there was also a question which came in, which was about most of the devolution seems to be around economic growth and around urban metro areas. Does that create a challenge for the model, that if you're looking at a more rural area, or what are your views and kind of how that fits, or how you've experienced it? Laura, do you have any thoughts on kind of the balance?
Authority model was literally introduced to address that issue, so that it is designed for areas that either are entirely county authorities, shire authorities, as we might have talked about in the past, or county with unitary. So if you look at the East Midlands, it's 2 counties, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and 2 unitaries, Nottingham City and Derby City. And when we advised them, so when we were doing the consultation, we got a lot of feedback around some of the challenges around the transport powers and the way that had been set up and worked for combined authorities, which were metro, and already had probably a combined transport authority, etc., doesn't quite work in that setting. And there's lots of issues around rural access and transport needs in rural areas where some of the routes are just not commercially fundable, etc. So there are different issues in different places. I think the combined county authority model, largely, not entirely, it's been worked out as it's gone along, but largely has tried to address those. And certainly, if the government's ambition is to cover most of the country with one of these combined authorities or combined county authorities, there are going to be more combined county authorities, because that's where the gaps are at the moment, is in those areas that have rural aspects to them. So I don't think it's a challenge to the model. I think there's a way through it which exists, which is the CCA. But it does go back to this place point, again, using East Midlands as an example, you've got 2 police and crime commissioners in that area. You've got sort of different margins of the Freeport as well, are around a completely different setting. The integrated care systems don't line up. So, what is place for that area is an interesting question. What I would say on what Ed was saying earlier about missions and place and how you achieve these things is that the powers are there somewhere. You look at all these bodies, health, local government, police and crime commissioners, others. There are enough powers in the system to do the things that the government wants to achieve, but it's how you use them. And there's lots of ways in which they can be used. And so I absolutely agree with Ed that the way you kind of get through this is have someone who can kind of convene, and then, you find your way through, because it's there somewhere. It's just not very neat and tidy at the moment. So I think that's one way through it.
Thank you. So final question to both of you, with our last few minutes. So there has been some talk about a new version of total place, which was a policy which existed for the last couple of years under the last Labour government, and ministers like Jim McMahon in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government have been talking about it again. Are you hearing anything about this, or what would be good for that to include? Because just as a reference point, the Labour manifesto, when it talked about mayoral combined authorities, was quite heavy on economic growth, whereas the total place policy is more about joining up public services. And I just was wondering if you had thoughts on that, or if you've heard anything, or if you can share any insights into that. Ed, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it definitely is on the cards, and I think it will form part of this agenda. I mean, for those who may not be as intimately familiar with it as others, this was a series of pilots that were run over the course of 2008-9 to kind of join together budgets, principally budgets and priority setting for a range of public sector partners across the local area. A lot of it was based on personal services, social care and those kinds of things, which traditionally have been very expensive. It was driven by the need for early intervention. So the idea being that, people take pathways through health and care, pathways through support around sort of housing, employment, skills, these kinds of things. You intervene early, you save money, but it's about making sure that partners are cited on the need to divert money appropriately, because everybody's got their own organisational blinkers on. So I think that if you look at the missions, the government has, a lot of them are very, very intimately connected with a lot of the objectives that existed around total place. So there is definitely an interest in talking about it and picking up on the themes that it developed, because it did. I think there was proof of concept around its effectiveness. The difficulty is that putting in place those arrangements takes investment and takes time as well, because you've got to redesign systems. You can't just kind of, it's not a quick fix. You're basically sort of redesigning systems and arrangements sort of from scratch. And I think that's why, when we talk about these kinds of things, that the messiness will remain, because it's to try and do this and fiddle around with the structures as well is kind of too much. We've got to do the minimum viable that we need to do in order to deliver the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. So total place, I think, will be there and will be a theme. We'll see that mentioned more. I think it will come into play in the missions, delivery against the missions. We'll hear words like prevention, early intervention coming up again and again, particularly in the context of social care and the health service and this kind of thing. It's going to be a theme. Total place will be one of the things that will be floating around the edges of that. But I think it will be an evolution of that vision.
Yeah, and just Laura, before I bring you in for a final comment, I think the previous version of total place was on a much smaller footprint than the mayoral combined authorities that we now have. Now, whether or not the new version makes use of the fact that those mayoral combined authorities and combined authorities are now there. I don't know. Laura, the final word to you.
I mean, just on that point, that was the final point I was going to make, is that whilst the model very much has been focused on economic development up until now, there are definitely, some of the combined authorities have this in there already, and these aspects, I think one of the Northeast ones, which is now the Northeast, had drug and alcohol rehabilitation, and they've got certain powers in relation to that, and they work with local charities, etc. on that. In the East Midlands, they insisted on the public health powers to tie up with homelessness, which is something they want to tackle around public health and health of individuals in that situation. So it's not, and Manchester's got health powers as well. So it's not kind of widespread. It's not in that standard package, but it's absolutely there and possible to be done within the structures that are already there. It hasn't been the absolute priority, but it could be. And I agree with Ed. I think total place is an idea that never really went away in many senses. It's just perhaps been looks slightly different. And yes, there's been a bit more focus on economics rather than the wider aspects of it. But I think that is where we're going to go back to, is to deliver these missions. You need to bring it in.
Yeah, it absolutely feels like unfinished business, I think, for some of the personalities here. Laura, Ed, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I will follow up with a link to the recording to people who registered for it. And yeah, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.